Has the new Trump administration's Putin pivot severely and irrevocably undermined the credibility of NATO and in particular their Article 5 Common Defense Clause? Привit, my name is Connor Klein, expert in international relations, been living in Ukraine, so I speak Ukrainian and Russian. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced and informed and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war and its consequences for Europe and the United States. So over the last few weeks, we've seen a very marked change in US foreign policy. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Article 5 protections have been the cornerstone of European or transatlantic security since more or less just after the end of the Second World War, when NATO was set up. And obviously back in those days, it was primarily to deter an invasion of Europe or maybe somewhere else in the North Atlantic by the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union has obviously disappeared, been consigned to the dustbin of history for now. And during the 1990s, in particular, NATO actually faced a bit of an identity crisis because it didn't have a very clear and present threat from a now independent Russia, and Moscow, which had been obviously the genesis to create the organization. So they went through a period of trying to go out of region in order not to go out of business. I think that was the expression back in the day. However, since 2008, with Russia's invasion of Georgia and then the first invasion of Ukraine in the Russo-Ukrainian war starting in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and parts of the Donbass, obviously that has extended quite dramatically with the 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Now Russia is a clear and present danger for European security and the inviolability of national borders. However, Donald Trump and his new administration in the White House do not see it that way. Back a few weeks ago, we had the Munich Security Conference, which is normally an opportunity for an American vice president to give a speech reinforcing America's commitment to NATO and its allies in Europe. However, J.D. Vance, the new American vice president, took the opportunity to describe not Russia and China as the biggest threat to European security, but European democracies themselves. And that has set up a chain of events that has undermined the credibility of NATO and the US's commitment to it. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but back in the campaign trail, Donald Trump made some comments that at the time people put down to hyperbole, saying that he would encourage Russia to attack countries that don't spend enough on their own national defense, that are part of NATO. And that already started to undermine the credibility that the US would come to the aid of its allies should they be attacked. Primarily, obviously, the biggest threat is indeed Russia. It is not European democracies that are going to launch an invasion at this moment in time. We've seen, obviously, Russia, which is a revanchist empire, attack Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. And there are certain countries that are particularly vulnerable that are in NATO to Russian revanchism, and that would be the three Baltic states and Poland primarily. Maybe you could even throw Finland in there, which has, since the 2022 invasion, actually joined NATO. So over the last few weeks, Donald Trump has made statements where he has talked about that he doesn't think that other NATO member states would come to the aid of the US if they were attacked. That is a bit of a paradoxical statement, since the only country to have actually invoked Article 5, which is the Common Defense Clause, when a country that is a member of the alliance is under attack, that the other countries come to its aid, is not specified in the text of Article 5 what exactly constitutes helping the country that's under attack. However, there has always been a belief that that would mean coming to the aid of, well, basically the US coming to the aid of other countries militarily, and particularly with its nuclear umbrella. There are two other countries that are nuclear in NATO, that would be France and the United Kingdom. But back in September 11, after those 9/11 attacks on the US actually invoked Article 5, and many countries did actually come to the aid of the US by providing troops and material and support, in particular for the, obviously, invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq that took place afterwards. Personally, I opposed the invasion of Iraq back in the day. I thought it was not a very prudent move and undermined the credibility of the US and international law by doing so. However, many countries at the time, even though in private they had a lot of reservations about what the US was doing, they felt that they had to go along with the US invasions because if they were to be attacked in the future, they would be relying on the US coming to their support. However, Donald Trump is gradually, day by day, undermining the credibility of deterrence within NATO by suggesting that he would not come to the defense of certain allies if they were to be attacked. Currently, the ones that are most at risk, the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, wearing the t-shirt today, Estonia, and then we have Poland. They actually spend the most as a percentage of their GDP, more or less, within NATO. Some of them, even like Poland, spending more in terms of percentage than the United States on its national defense. So one could try to rationalize that Donald Trump is not talking about leaving the Baltic states and Poland undefended should they be attacked in the future by Russia. However, the fact that he talks about this undermines the credibility of that deterrence. And even if you were actually ultimately to come to Poland or one of the Baltic states' defense, Russia would be way more likely to actually test Article 5 and launch an invasion on the basis that it is at best ambiguous whether the United States would come. So just by not having that strong deterrence there and a credible Article 5 reaction, it could actually provoke or lead to a miscalculation by Russia, which would mean launching an invasion. We also had a little bit of a diplomatic spat. Obviously, they had a massive one between Vladimir Zelensky and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in the Oval Office about 10 days ago. And since, actually even before that, Donald Trump was describing Zelensky as a dictator, saying, basically blaming Ukraine for starting the war, even though Ukraine and US have been allied for many years, even if Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Then we saw that huge bust-up in the Oval Office, which played out in public. I'm sure things like this go on in private. The fact that this was played out in public and that the White House seems to be trying to do all its negotiations in public is absolutely, completely misguided and a huge diplomatic faux pas, because they are allowing Russia to see the division and also revealing all their, not just negotiating positions, but actual final positions. US has given basically given up most of their bargaining chips, or many of their bargaining chips, with Russia. First of all, it's a little bit ridiculous that they're even trying to negotiate this, since they don't want to include the Europeans or Ukraine in the discussions very much, and ultimately this is a war that will have to be resolved either militarily or diplomatically between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, other countries have influence, like the United States, like China, like Iran, like North Korea, like European countries, for example, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France. However, all of this is reaching a crescendo, and Poland has basically outlined that it will look for alternatives to Starlink, which is run by Elon Musk and provides satellite and communication services to the Ukrainian military should Ukraine's Starlink be turned off by the United States. Over the last week, we've seen the United States pull military support. Obviously, previously they pulled the financial and humanitarian support via USAID that Elon Musk, now that he plays a leading role in this new Trump administration, had actually closed down. We see them stop sharing intelligence, which blinds the Ukrainians with respect to force concentrations on the Russian side of the line of contact. And they have since then rendered a lot of the use of the F-16 fighter planes obsolete. Well, maybe not obsolete, but they have undermined the effectiveness of them, and also prevented Mazar, which is a private company, from sharing satellite footage with the Ukrainians. All of this suggests that the US is undermining not a NATO ally, but another ally, and basically trying to offer them up on a plate to Russia, and a capitulation in order to, for some odd reason, curry favor with Moscow. This further undermines the credibility of NATO, because if the US is willing to weaken European security and throw an ally under the bus, then can the NATO allies expect better treatment, even though that's obviously tied into the NATO treaty? We've seen over the last few days that Poland and the three Baltic states are preparing more seriously for a potential Russian invasion. We've seen Poland outline that it will build its army to 500,000. It will also leave a few conventions that Lithuania has already left with respect to using anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, which could be used in defense from, say, an attack out of Kaliningrad or out of Belarus, which is allied with Russia, which would attack the Suwałki Gap. Potentially, Suwałki is a city on the border in Poland with Lithuania, and there is a narrow gap between the Kaliningrad exclave and Belarus. So they are taking it more and more seriously. So, in summary, the Putin pivot by Donald Trump, it has, at this point, undermined the credibility of Article 5. That could be repaired by a future administration or a change of policy by the Trump government. However, it is unlikely that NATO allies in Europe are going to depend on US materiel and weapons going forward, and weapon systems, because they see how the fact that Ukraine was, to a certain extent, dependent on US supplies is being used effectively to blackmail Ukraine into a potential capitulation to Russia, and they will not want to be in that position. I think that is basically not going to be able to be reversed at this point, because if you're a country, and even if the policy changes now or when there's a new American administration, you would have to think that, well, in 4 years, maybe the voters in the US vote in someone who's going to go back to the Trump policy of the Putin pivot. So that is already fundamentally weakened the NATO alliance. The next steps that would probably be the final nail in the coffin for NATO, at least on a practical level, would be that the US started to pull its troops out of countries like Poland, the three Baltic states, maybe out of Germany. That would be forward positions to obviously respond to a Russian attack. That is one of the demands by Russia. Again, since Trump launched this negotiation, shuttle diplomacy policy, Russia has actually increased its demands. Why? Because the Trump administration keeps saying that Ukraine will not join NATO, that Ukraine needs to make territorial concessions to Russia, and because they keep moving the goalposts more towards Russia, Russia simply increases its demands. If that were to happen, or if the next step were to be that the US cuts off Starlink, this will further undermine the credibility of NATO and probably push it past the point of no return, at least for this administration, for the next 4 years, that the US would respond to an attack on, say, one of the three Baltic states or Poland with a military intervention to eject Russian forces. So in conclusion, I'd like to just point out that at the moment, there is very little potential for Russia to actually invade the three Baltic states or Poland. Why? Simply, their army is bogged down in Ukraine. And until they get in a situation where they can move those forces to the borders with Poland or the three Baltic states, then there is no immediate risk of a Russian invasion and them testing Article 5, at least the threshold of an invasion. So that gives an incentive for Poland and three Baltic states to massively support Ukraine and make sure that they do not make any concessions that will lead to even a ceasefire, and definitely not a very bad long-term peace deal that would probably mean that Russia would take control of Ukraine, because for the moment, Russia having its battle-hardened troops in the Kursk Oblast or on the line of contact in Ukraine means that they will not be able to invade realistically any of these countries, and it buys Poland and the three Baltic states a lot more time. They've used the last 3 years pretty well, and by them buying even more time to prepare their defenses puts them in a stronger position in order to resist a Russian attack and create their own deterrence. That deterrence can be a conventional army. Defense is making it very hard. The porcupine strategy of making it really hard for Russia to swallow it. Also, they may join an alliance or emphasize that they have a nuclear umbrella from other countries, maybe like France and the United Kingdom, or they may even pursue their own nuclear weapons in particular. That would be attractive to Poland. Remember, Budapest Memorandum 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, the Soviet nuclear arsenal that was stationed in Ukraine, in exchange for security assurances that apparently are not worth the paper they were written on, because Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum and the United States did not respond. So a security assurance doesn't mean very much, and Ukraine wants a security guarantee that the US will actually be obligated to respond militarily should Russia breach a potential future ceasefire or a peace agreement. So I'm going to leave it at that, and write me your comments down below in the comment section, whether you think that Article 5 is still credible, whether you think the NATO alliance is de facto defunct at this point, or whether you think it still is credible, that it still has a future, whether maybe with a new US administration in 4 years that it is all repairable, or whether you think the damage is now permanent. And I will say, I don't have a Ukrainian t-shirt, I have a Lithuanian one on today. Slava Ukraini, and do peremоги.